When thinking about violence in our society and how to move towards a more peaceful and harmonious relationship with each other, there are a number of different ways we can go about this. Obviously, we can legislate, which has been around for some time, yet we still have people being violent and countries invading other countries. What are some other ways that we can overcome that? What are some of the other causes of violence that may need to be addressed? Enjoy this discussion with Brad Mewhort as we talk about overcoming trauma as a way of overcoming violence in our society.
Welcome to eSHAIR.care, an all-inclusive community sharing experience, strength, and hope to create strong, healthy, and inspiring relationships. eSHAIR.care communities work toward every individual feeling safe, valued, and heard, free from the threat of danger, pain, or harm. Each episode, founder Damian Andrews explores the principles underpinning eSHAIR.care and invites expert special guests to share their knowledge so you can easily reap the benefits so many others experience. You hold the choice to create your future. Let it be with strong, healthy, and inspiring relationships.
Hello and welcome to eSHAIR. Here we discuss, promote, and share the benefits to all from living in an egalitarian society, including men. Inaccurate propaganda leads some men to believe that they miss out with equality. The reality, suppressing women is detrimental to men. Creating a world where everyone can contribute equally makes everyone better off. Now, today it is my great pleasure to welcome Brad Mewhort to the show. Brad has a mission to prevent male-on-male violence and end physical bullying. Brad believes that men healing from violence and finding peace within themselves are keys to enabling humanity and all of life on Earth to flourish. He wrote the book, The Peaceful Man, in service of this mission and as a means of helping men embark on journeys of healing. Welcome, Brad.
Thank you, Damian. It's good to be here.
It's certainly a pleasure to have you on the show, and I'm very excited, having read some of your book, and I'm very excited to have people on the show and hear about that. Do you want to start, though, before we get into the book, do you want to start a bit with your background and the challenges that you faced to lead you to do what you're doing now?
Certainly. So, in a sense, I could say where much of my path and even the book started from is going back to when I was an adolescent, when I was 13 years old, and I was being bullied quite severely.
Mm-hmm.
And the only way I found through that bullying, to at least lessen it a great deal, was to become violent myself, to learn to fight back. And
Mm-hmm.
this, in many ways, set very much of my mindset through my adolescence and even into my early adulthood, that violence was everywhere, that violence was inescapable, and the only way that I could be safe was to have capacity for violence myself. And in many respects, I would say I outgrew this even in my early adulthood.
Mm-hmm.
But as time went on through my adulthood, I've realized over and over how I've still been affected by that violence. In some sense, I could say realizing that I experienced trauma as a result of that violence that has continued to have emotional, psychological impacts on me over time. And this led me to do a lot of healing work. And I would even go so far as to say I've gone through many cycles of going very deep into healing work through my adult years. And about a decade ago, I started offering some of what I have worked on myself and learned to other men. I've trained in various somatic practices, teaching somatic, or in other words, body-based practices, developmental coaching, contemplative practices, working with these, facilitating groups, men's groups, and holding space and teaching to help other men to go on their own healing journeys.
That's pretty impressive that you've done that, especially if given, as you say, you experienced it, but you also became someone that enacted violence as well. What if you were to take it back to its roots? What do you think is that cause that leads to people to act violently?
In the vast majority of cases, I think one of the primary things that enables people to initiate violence to or escalate violence on their own is having been victims of violence. I think it's very rare, extremely rare, for someone who has not been a victim of violence to become a perpetrator
Mm,
of violence. And I think the mechanism of that is simply when someone's a victim of violence, they're experiencing their own boundaries being violated, their body being disrespected, their life not being respected. And that's learned. Like, oh, my boundaries, my body, my life is not respected. Well, why would I respect the boundaries and the bodies of anyone else? And along those lines, I see violence is as never being an isolated act, almost never being an isolated act, at least. I see it as being something that happens in patterns and in cycles that gets propagated between men in particular, boys and men, between people in general, really. And so, our own violence, what we've experienced, if we haven't done our healing work, I could say we're at risk of propagating that onto others, and not just committing an act of violence, but actually propagating all of these cycles and patterns.
right. And from that perspective, if you to go back to your experiences, as you said, I'm taking it you didn't grow up with violence when you were younger. It was the bullying that you experienced as an adolescent. And so talk us through that process. So it sounds like primary school or the younger school was okay for you, but it was when you got to adolescence that you started to experience that. So it sounds like there was a shift in your persona, firstly, when you experienced that violence, and then how to adjust to that. Do you want to talk us through that?
Yeah, certainly. So there were, I wouldn't say my earlier years were completely free of violence, but relatively mild. Or in fact, I would even go so far as to say very mild at that stage. And yes, it was in my adolescence when I was 13 that it the violence that I was experiencing increased dramatically.
Hmm.
And what happened? My family moved across to the other side of the city that we were living in, a small town in British Columbia. And so I was going into high school for the first time.
Hmm.
So, and I didn't know anyone,
Yep.
and was taking the bus home from school. So having to wait half an hour for the bus after school every day, which is when most of these bullying incidents were occurring. And at first, I felt a lot of shame about
Mm.
what was happening. I didn't even tell my parents about what was happening at first, just because I was very ashamed to be so vulnerable.
Yeah.
But then it kept escalating. It kept becoming more severe. And my parents, and eventually I did tell my parents about it, and they talked to the administration of the school, who didn't do anything. They're kind of like, well, boys will be boys. This is what happens. They didn't take it very seriously.
Yep.
And after that, my dad told me that the only way I think that you're going to stop this bullying is to fight back, to,
Yep.
you know, to not, it was usually a group of boys, all much larger than me,
Mm.
who were bullying me. But my dad's advice was to just grab one of them and fight him, and then it'll turn into a one-on-one fight.
Yeah.
And at first, it just sounded utterly crazy to me. Like, I can't do that. Like that, I'll get killed.
Mm.
But then one day, there was what happened. I had two boys holding each of my legs, and they were basically having a tug of war with me. They were pulling my two
Yeah.
legs apart as hard as they could,
Yeah.
and I experienced this terror when this was happening. I didn't know if I would. I didn't know if I'd ever walk again. I didn't know if I was going to walk away from this incident with my
Yeah.
body intact without being permanently crippled.
Mm.
And that was enough to have me decide that what my dad was advising me to do to fight back was actually seemed more reasonable and was less terrifying than what might happen if I didn't do anything.
Yeah.
So told my dad, yeah, okay, I'll do it. And he constructed this makeshift punching bag and taught me how to punch.
Yeah.
And a couple days later at school, I was decided, okay, I'm I'm gonna fight back. And few boys circled around me, and I grabbed one of them and I just punched him and punched him and punched him
Yeah.
until I actually won the fight. My dad had said, it doesn't matter if you win or lose. If you fight back, you're no longer an easy target. You'll
Yeah.
be at least a lot more left alone. And I actually won the fight. And while I certainly wouldn't say that was altogether the end of bullying for the rest of my adolescence, it went down to a minimal level compared to what it had been.
Mm.
So that was kind of my journey in experiencing a lot more violence and actually learning to be violent, to at least respond with violence,
Mm.
and to see the importance from my adolescent perspective of being capable of violence.
Yeah, that's interesting that you say that because I had a senior mentor or a fatherly mentor when I was younger who had a similar sort of advice in respect of I wasn't being bullied at the time, but we were talking about things like that. And he said to me, he said, "Yeah, if there's a group of people that look like they're going to be menacing and they're coming to threaten you, he said, pick the biggest one that's there and hit them." Because they're usually the leader, and if you pick the biggest guy, the other ones are going to run away. And it's fascinating that you say that, because that was a mentality certainly or not that long ago, that was the case, and certainly I would say still exists in some areas as well. Because I look at
Right.
my son's school, my son's 14, and it's certainly a very, very different environment
Mm.
as to what I was having this discussion with another friend where we were talking about, childhood. And back then, when you got a swirly, that was literally your head was put in the toilet and they flushed it, which doesn't, well, certainly in a lot of areas doesn't happen anymore now. Um, with that, do you think? I mean, because part of your work, having looked through your book, it's it's also understanding that, as you say, that this need to be violent, to pick on other people, and that's a learn. You mentioned before that's a learned behavior. Do you want to talk more about that and explain what you talk about in your book about how this is from a bully's perspective, the bully has actually learnt that from previous experience, if I understood what was in your book and what you've just
Right.
said correctly. Do you want to explain a little bit more about that, please?
Yeah. So first of all, as humans, and I would say especially as men,
Mm.
we certainly, it's within our genetic programming to be capable of being violent. That's, I would say, an obvious fact, just given, looking around the world, we have the
Mm.
capacity for violence. And I think we have other capacities to be other ways. This there being so much violence, I think, comes more from what we experience and even
Mm.
from our culture. I mentioned the school administration saying, oh, well, boys will be boys.
Mm.
And what I think is that would actually be a more true expression is that traumatized boys will traumatize more boys.
I like that. Yeah.
And in our culture, most of our heroes are heroes because of their capacity for violence. Even the good guys, Batman, Superman, etc., they're heroes because they have capacities for violence. And we even see this, in many of our real life heroes. The Ultimate Fighting Championship and war heroes.
Mm.
So many of the men that are glorified and idealized are glorified and idealized because of their capacity for violence.
Mm.
And I think that sends a message about how acceptable that violence is acceptable, that it's part of life, that it's just part of being a man. In fact, that's even, being a man. I think this is becoming less true today, but traditionally, being a man was equated to an extent with being tough in some way.
Yeah.
So this is one part of it, and then I think actually I'll add one thing to that. So because violence is so acceptable and
Mm.
normalized in our culture, I think that a lot of boys who grow into men don't even acknowledge or realize that they did have experiences with violence that in
Mm.
which they experienced trauma. It's just like, oh, well, I didn't experience that much violence. It's normal. There's nothing to it. And yet, I think that a lot of that, even ordinary kinds of violence, does leave trauma in its wake
Yeah.
and makes men more likely to end up perpetrating violence, in large or small ways. And I think it also affects men's emotional health a great deal as
Mm.
well. It can be anxiety, uh, depression. These things can come from trauma, especially as we get into more severe violence.
Yeah. And this capacity for violence, because if I understand correctly, and I'm not an expert in biology, but from what I understand, from what I've read, I mean, part of that is the testosterone that men have. They have a high level of testosterone, which can be manifested that way. And from what I've read, that's part of that trigger. It's the testosterone high levels. Men with high levels of testosterone have more capacity for violence.
Yeah.
It's also a driver of other things as well. Like, I mean, the drive to make love is driven by that, is from what I understand as well. So it's an interesting double-edged sword there that we've got. And
Definitely.
if you look at whether you believe in creationism or whether you believe in evolution, either way, the fact that we have that is for a purpose. It's there for a reason, whichever way you want to go for it. And because I want to draw in from here, because my experience, I mean, I served with the Australian Special Air Service Regiment, which is our equivalent of your special forces, the top of the military as far as that
Right.
counterterrorism, all that kind of thing. I've worked with some of the police tactical response groups as part of that, and also through other friends, have friends that are in those spaces. Now, and all the men there that I knew had great capacity for violence. They were extremely capable, extremely skilled. But unless you knew what they did, other than seeing that they were physically strong, you wouldn't know it because they had that under control. And similar, a friend of mine, my son's karate sensei, he's a 7th Dan black belt, and he works in the space of with dealing with people that have been victims of violence and who are also perpetrators of violence, and how
Mm.
to prevent that. Um, so how do we draw that distinction? Because it seems to me the people that are really well trained in that, so someone that, and I studied a lot of martial arts when I was younger, and the whole purpose of that was more about peace, centering, and control. than it was. And maybe it was because, I'm sure there's some teachers that don't teach that. For those who've watched Cobra Kai and Karate Kid and stuff like that, there's, strike first kind of thing. But I think that's the
Right.
rarity in that space as opposed to the norm. And I'm just wondering, from that capacity, we have that as a biological thing. And for someone to have experienced violence and as you say, they might not even realize their trauma, feeling that trauma, um, yet they have a need to push that out that way because they don't have that training. I mean, to the extent from my side of things, this is going to sound ridiculous, but a lot of times when there's a bug in the house, I don't squash it. I take it outside and let it go. Um, which, it just, I don't have this need to do that. I'm capable of it, but I don't have the need to do that. And I'm just wondering, is it a training thing where we need to say, hey, yes, you have this capacity and you need to have that under control?
Yeah, so I think you're touching on a lot of nuanced territory here.
Mm.
So to start with, I would, if I was designing an ideal world, what the world would become,
Mm.
I would like to I would love to really minimize the violence
Yes.
such that, knowing martial arts and, having special forces that are highly trained to be violent just wouldn't even be necessary
Yeah.
in a more peaceful world. That
Yeah.
would certainly be the ideal, which I think what is at least a wonderful aspiration
Yes.
for all of us.
Mm.
But that said, even putting aside the way the world actually is right now, there seems to be violence inherent in life. Like
Yeah.
carnivorous animals eat other animals. There's
Mm.
and that there and the animal being eaten or being hunted, certainly they can experience trauma. Uh, there is something in just simply the way that life is on Earth that does seem to contain violence. We're not going to convince lions to become vegans.
Yes. Yes. Some people have tried, I believe, but it didn't do the lions any good.
Right, right. And then looking at how the world actually is, there is a great deal of violence in it.
Mm.
And in many cases, I think actually the only thing containing violence actually is other violence. And I think that's unfortunate, but
Mm.
it's also realistically how the world is. And you mentioned martial arts, and I went on to study martial arts for years as
Mm.
well. And that was really, in a sense, that was how I found to feel safe in the
Yeah.
world. I didn't recognize it that way at the time, but in retrospect, I'm like, oh, yeah, I studied martial arts because having the capacity for violence was the only way that I knew to really truly feel safe and have comfort
Mm.
in the world. And and even on the level of international relations, there is the capacity for violence of some countries is what keeps other countries in check from executing violence. So
Yes.
as much as I think it's so critical for the world to reduce the amount of male on male violence, and for us individually to heal from the violence we've experienced in order to make it a more peaceful and safe world for everybody. At the same time, I'm certainly not a pure pacifist.
Mm.
For example, if my own life was threatened, or the life of my wife, if we were threatened with violence, I would respond with violence. I'm not a vegan. I do eat meat. Uh,
Mm.
so I'm not a pure pacifist. I do see the necessity of violence in some instances, and I think to be healthy, that capacity for violence needs to be held in a lot of emotional and psychological health. You mentioned special forces, etc., and I think a lot of those people are experiencing, do experience trauma from what they see, what they have to do.
Yeah.
And I would also say it comes from a lot healthier place than a lot of others. And I think that there could be benefit to actually those capacities going along with even a lot more internal work on really having that internal peace and resilience.
Yeah, it's an interesting point that you mentioned there with the military, and I was going to touch on that because, um, and I want to get back to the peaceful society as well because it's something I think I'm thinking of. I mention movies a lot, and I don't actually watch that much movies, but I was thinking of the movie The Demolition Man, which is an old Stallone and oh, I've forgotten the other actor's name, but the society has moved forward where they're not actually police officers, they're peace officers, and they ensure that that things stay peaceful. And when they actually there's a violent, I've forgotten the name, the actor who played anyway. When he actually gets transformed into the future, they're going, we don't know how to deal with this level of violence because he was a hardened criminal that came into this future world. Anyway,
Mm.
but what I wanted to talk about was that trauma, because even from a military perspective, and I know from my own perspective, there was a certain level of trauma that had to be dealt with, and then when it was dealt with effectively, everything was okay. There was a nice balance there from my personal experience, and it wasn't there. It was not an issue anymore. But prior to actually addressing that, yeah, there was emotional issues there. And is it a process? Because that's what your book is about teaching people to deal with that. When you talk about the different methodologies, especially getting in touch with your body, do you want to explain some of that, dealing with that violence or the trauma from violence, and how a person can work through that?
I'd love to. So first of all, I see the healing process as kind of being a spiral.
Yeah.
And certainly, when we're dealing with trauma, there can be deep healing, and then it seems like, okay, that's resolved. My experience personally and in working with others is that it comes back around, that
Mm.
there's not generally a final healing, like, okay, I dealt with that, it's done. It's like, great, you have much more internal peacefulness and resilience, and it's healed for right now, and it
Mm.
will probably come back around. And on the one hand, that could be demoralizing, like, oh, it's never going to completely go away. But on the other hand, I actually see it, it does in a sense become easier and easier through the cycles. And I think there's also something beautiful about it. We can continue to find more peacefulness, etc., within ourselves as we do more healing work.
Can I draw an analogy to that from my experience, in the sense
Yeah,
of,
please.
because you're correct. From my experience, it's like anything; it doesn't just go away. You have to constantly be working on it. But similar, I used to be a smoker,
Mm,
and when I first, I could always quit whenever I wanted to, and I did. But then there was, times I go back and I'd bit a social thing, and I want to have a cigarette, but that stopped a long time ago. Where and progressively over time, because it's been such a long time since I've had a cigarette, all of a sudden it's something that's minor. So it's initially there's the difficulty there. If I can draw that analogy,
mhm.
so that people can have that hope that it might be a little bit difficult initially, but over time it becomes actually something you just have to kind of monitor, and even just monitor a little bit. So yeah.
Right. Yeah, beautiful. So then, in terms of the healing process, well, and actually, I want to say first of all that there's no one way to heal. There's no best way to heal,
Mm.
to do the healing work. There's different things work well at different times. Different things work well for different people. So in any given recommendation, there's no shaming of any other way of doing
Mm.
healing work, or a claim that this is the way it's been done. In
Yeah.
a sense, I would say, if you're drawn to doing any kind of healing work, great, do that. Do what actually draws you, what's available to you right now, what feels right to you right now. And perhaps other things will come around and be the right things later. But
Mm.
really just do whatever it is that feels right to you and is present for you if you're
Yes.
drawn to that work. Now that said, for what I would say for most people is the the path of healing tends to go something like this is, first of all, just becoming aware of
Mm.
how you've been affected by violence, of even that you've been involved with violence and the impacts that it is having on you. Just the simple awareness of that, acknowledging it, acknowledging the impacts that it had on you at the time that it happened, how you felt at the time, how it's impacting you now, how you feel about it now.
Yeah.
And from there, a step beyond that simple awareness is really getting into your stories about it,
Mm.
reflecting on what actually happened. What do you recall from it?
Mhm.
And for most people, it's very helpful and healing to share your stories
Mm.
with someone else, ideally a listening professional of some type who can hear your stories without judgment.
Yes.
And in a sense, I see this as the process of bringing what was what we were holding in the shadows of our minds
Mm.
and bringing that into the light. It's often these stories, the how we were impacted, how we felt. I think it's often held in shame, in fear,
Mm.
in anger. And these are things that we, can be difficult to acknowledge and that we perhaps don't want to acknowledge in a sense.
Yes.
But then there's often just so much relief to talk to someone, share this with someone, and really bring it into the light. So
Yeah.
I think that for most people, that's kind of the early stages of healing. Although it can kind of happen anywhere in the healing process too, and have great value in that. But I think that is so important. And then I think what often happens is I think that this kind of sharing about our stories, talking about it,
Mm.
it is deeply healing, but I see that as only going to a certain point. It really doesn't typically take us to what I would think of as the deeper levels of healing, the deepest levels of healing.
Right.
And going into deeper levels of healing, I see often at least somatic practices. In other words, working with the body, the awareness of body awareness and patterns in the body as being that deeper healing.
Do you want to talk a bit about those practices as well?
Yeah. So when we experience violence,
Mhm.
we experience the violence against our bodies. When we
Yes.
commit violence, we commit the violence with our bodies. And I do think that perpetrating violence is traumatizing as well. Certainly
Ah,
being a
there's
victim
no
of violence
question.
is traumatizing, but there can be horror in what we're doing and memories in the body of violence that we've committed. So that too, I believe, can be traumatizing and uh, require healing work to kind of get clear of and find peacefulness beyond.
Mm.
And what often happens is in any experience with violence, victim or perpetrator,
Mhm.
our bodies go into fight, flight, freeze.
Yes.
And these patterns of what happens in the fight, flight, freeze can, in a sense, become embedded, become ongoing patterns in our
Yeah.
bodies, such that there's muscles being held,
Yeah.
there's tension, there's ways that we restrict our movement,
Yeah.
and our entire nervous system, in a sense, gets locked into these habits, these patterns, and it doesn't even experience them anymore. Really, our nervous system is designed to experience changes, to experience differences from the baseline.
Yeah.
And if some kind of pattern of holding in the body from trauma
Mm.
is our baseline, we don't even notice it. We don't even experience it. And this can be with facial expressions. It can be the way we move our
Yeah.
bodies. It can be tension. It can be, it can be in our voices. It can be big muscles. It can be small muscles. And in some sense, when our bodies are in these patterns, they are our bodies still in that experience of violence.
Yeah.
And there can be a lot of deep healing that comes from becoming aware of those patterns,
Yeah.
realizing you have choice, that you can release those patterns, and developing new healthy patterns
Hmm.
that create more freedom,
Hmm.
more peace in the body. And this can kind of come up in different ways, the ways people arrive at this. Sometimes it is just wanting to clear some of these emotional experiences, psychological experiences that we realize are held in the body. But sometimes too, these tensions and these habits of movement, unhealthy habits, can lead to discomfort and pain in the body in some ways. So sometimes what can also happen is we engage with somatic work, with body-based practices, and as some of these habits change, these patterns change, we actually find that our emotional health is improving as well, because it is uh, bringing further healing to some of these traumatic experiences we've had in relation to violence.
Right. So from a a perpetrator perspective, you say they've experienced violence, and I look at that from my perspective. From my background as well, it's something that I grew up with, so I can relate to that, and as a way of defense mechanism. And like you, I learned. It's interesting how things evolve, because I learned martial arts partly for that reason, and it was a big part for that reason, for self defense. Whereas my son, I got him to do karate not for self defense, but for self control and for stillness.
Mm,
Because he was quite he was a little bit agitated and wouldn't sit still. So I thought karate's a good discipline for you to
mm,
do that, and that was part of the selection of the sensei as well. Was that was his focus, was this is about self control, this is about
nice.
discipline, not and so it's interesting how that dynamic changed between one generation. I learned it for self-defense and to be violent in return, whereas Benjamin learnt it to be still. Well, he
Mm.
didn't know it because he was very young when he was but that was my motivation, was purely for stillness. And coming back to what you were saying there, was being aware of what is going on both for yourself and for the other person. So is that, because when you mentioned about being in a peaceful society, is that a case of recognizing that there's more power? And I'm kind of leading this a little bit in a way, but is it a way of recognizing that, creating is actually, and it takes longer to create, as we know. It's easy to destroy something.
Right.
Well, it's much quicker to destroy something than it is to create something. But recognizing there's more power in creating, there's more, not just power into the world, but for yourself. We know that giving creates so much. A friend of mine put it as, he said that he used to do some fairly hard drugs, and he says there's the high that I get from giving doesn't even is so much better than any high I ever had from drugs, and it's ongoing.
Mm.
Is that part of that education and that healing process, recognizing that there's much more power in actually helping people than oppressing people?
I think it can be, and that it's an important part of it for many people. And I think that as we become healthier and resolve our trauma, I think what often arises is an impulse to be of service and
Yes.
to be a force of healing in the world. I think a lot of when we're very much in our trauma and locked in it, and without even realizing it, seeing the world through the eyes of our trauma and the experience we've had, I think it can lead to a lack of regard for other people in small ways. I'm not even talking at this point about the potential to end up perpetrating violence against other people,
Mm,
but just having a lack of regard for the impacts of our actions. Thinking in kind of a corporate level, like, oh well, excuse me, I'm following the law. I may be, destroying rivers and forests, but I'm following the law, so it's all good. I'm making lots of money. I'm taking care of my family. I think it becomes when we are in a frame of the world being an unsafe, violent place, this trauma can lead us to act in ways that are really not at the in the best interest of humanity. And being a member of humanity is not even really in the best interest of yourself, but it can be, I think it can be hard to really have a larger care when we are locked in our trauma. And
yeah.
as we work through it, as we become healthier within ourselves, there's more of a desire to be of service and to have a larger care for for humanity, for life, for the planet.
I love that, and I love what you've raised there, because it connects to something that I've been working on. As you say, it's one thing to say it's yeah, I'm following the law, it's okay, and had been doing a lot of thinking on that and for whatever reason, I'd been drawn to the old Knights Code, and what when looking at the principles, well, what that was, it was a set of higher principles, regardless of if you could or whether you're allowed to. It was always to check in with these higher principles as to whether you should do it or not. And even though you're allowed to, or you were capable of it, it was you were governed by those higher principles. And do you think that's something we need to come back to, and just to have that check in as we move forward to go, well, just because I can doesn't mean I should.
Absolutely. I think that's important on so many levels. And we have principles, kind of that lead to rules. And certainly if we follow those, we're certainly doing better individually and collectively than if we are ignoring those rules. But on the other hand, I think truly a flourishing, thriving, peaceful world requires more, we might say, more evolved principles
Mm.
than just simply the basics. It requires a larger perspective in the decisions we make.
And do we need to start thinking about that? Do we need to start setting that as a guiding thing and start talking more about, okay, this is what it requires for a peaceful society, not only what it requires, but the benefits of. I know from my perspective, my life is certainly um, much better now because of how I approach things
Yeah.
than it was 20 years ago when I was, if I reacted, in a more aggressive manner to something. And I'll come back to that in a minute. But do you think we need to start promoting and setting those principles?
I think that is important. And I think what's even more important is doing our healing work.
Yes.
And
Okay.
the reason for that is we could have the most sophisticated, most beautiful principles, but if we haven't done our healing work,
Yeah.
then when there's something that brings up a trigger, and we I think everyone's always comes across sooner or later things that trigger them, no matter how much work they've done. If you haven't done your healing work, when that trigger comes up, your reaction isn't going to come from these beautiful principles that you have when you are at your best.
Yeah.
Your reaction is going to be, going back to coming from a place of trauma. That's what we're at risk of falling into
Mm.
when we are triggered. That's the risk of people who have been victims of violence becoming perpetrators of violence. In some sense, they're being we could say that they're often triggered into that, and it could be even much smaller reactions. Yelling at someone, becoming, what is our reaction when we are the most challenged?
Mm.
In a sense, I think that is what is most important to work on, is that deep healing, such that we can find from a place of peacefulness, even when we're triggered, even when we're threatened, that we have choice to respond in the way that, in a sense, we could say our highest self would want to respond.
Yes.
And if you have that level of healing, if you found that peace within yourself, if you have that resilience,
Mm.
then absolutely those principles that you're talking about, so important, so wonderful. But those principles, without having the healing foundation, I don't think hold up for very, very far. They can become kind of abstract and theoretical, and certainly may have some benefit, but may not have the benefit we would want when the rubber hits the road, so to speak.
Yeah, that's a really important point that you make. And that comes back to what you mentioned before about we form patterns of violence. So that it's a cause and reaction. And that links to, as we go through this process, our behaviors are generally unconscious. It's very rarely that we'll do something consciously,
Right.
so certainly as we get older. So, and you think about that from driving a car. If you turn the indicator on your car, you're not consciously thinking about it. Just happens. You want to turn left, and your indicator goes on. Although in America, you don't turn your indicator when you go left, do you? Because you're allowed to in the traffic lights. Or is it right? I can't remember. I don't know which side you're on the road. In Australia, we're backwards here.
Right. Right.
um, but from that perspective, with these learned behaviors, because I think about that, when you were talking about that, I was remembering my own experience, and going back, and I mentioned this, touched on this just before, was this reaction to a circumstimulus response. If someone acts to you aggressively, we're taught to, well, we learn to, I would say, rather than taught, we learn that we all of a sudden get defensive and react in an aggressive way as well. And what happens when you put gas, in your case, petrol in my case, on a fire, it
Right.
just gets bigger. And I mean, I know from my experience that now I've learned to react differently. So if someone comes, and it's rare that I'll have someone come with me, it's interesting how that changed so when I look at it, very rarely will someone come to me in an aggressive, even in a negotiation or something like that, just because my demeanor is very different. To the extent, I'm going to probably reference Crocodile Dundee twice in this interview, but I'm thinking about I know when I go out on the street and walk down the street, there's a demeanor that I have now where people, it's almost like Crocodile Dundee going, "G'day, mate, g'day." I'm walking expecting people to be kind and happy, and a lot of times, without even me noticing it, people look up me and smile at me now. I've noticed that. Usually because when someone turns around, it's like, oh, and I give them that welcome and smile, and it creates a different relationship. Whereas 20 years ago, that didn't happen. And certainly now, when someone, in the rare occasions where it does happen, where someone is aggressive, I rather than immediately getting to that defensive thing, it's more an inquisitive thing. Oh, tell me more about what you're experiencing, and
Right.
it facilitates a completely different response when you don't get aggressive. Is that part of? So that's my experience, and it's certainly something I'd love to. Well, I'm sharing, sharing on
Yeah.
podcast. But it's amazing how we're in situations where it could have. I know from my history, it would have escalated into something that could have been a yelling match, and most
Right.
likely would have been a yelling match, from my previous experience. And I look at it, and I've mentioned this, for the listeners will have heard this before, but in the parenting of my son, I've never yelled at him ever in the entire 14 years,
Beautiful.
and I've never needed to. And so I'm just wondering, is that some of that healing process of realizing there is actually different ways to address that, and not only different, they provide better outcomes.
Absolutely. I couldn't give a better example than what you just described. Yes, that is, uh, I'm going to say, one of the most important aspects
Mm.
of what I believe can and generally does come out of the healing process. That's so important, and that on a larger level, it brings more peace and more health to larger society. I mean, your son is probably bringing what he's experienced in a sense to his peers, and this is how there's potential, I think, for really a more thriving world for all of us. And we can bring that to our loved ones, the ones close to us. What you're describing, you've never even yelled at him, let alone, I'm assuming, let alone struck him.
Yeah, correct. I haven't, yeah, peacefully struck him with that. Yeah.
No. And I think even parents who have the best of intentions, who perhaps haven't done quite so much healing work, and have had their own traumatizing experiences, can have moments of reaction where they strike their children, even if very occasionally. And I think those can be very traumatizing to children.
How can we're talking through that, as you say, moments of reaction, and I know that happens, and certainly from my perspective, that's not to say that, he's been a model child and been this, person that's done everything right all the time. It's been
Right.
my reaction that's been different, and it was
Right.
different, and I found, it was really interesting, talking. I'm doing some work with some people in Afghanistan, and they're talking about, obviously some violence there, and it was interesting. One of the reports I was reading from a friend of mine who wrote it was that the mothers were saying, they were given some education on parenting, and they go, I've got such a different relationship with my child now that I'm not beating them. And it was just this eye-opening thing. The mothers were saying this, because
Mm,
that was what they were taught. And
right.
then they noticed a more closer relationship, from that change in behavior. But how do we, what are some of those healing processes to take people through to go, well, in this moment? Because I said, it's not to say my son has never done anything that, would, if I was a different person, and I had children late, so I had a lot of time to develop this.
Right.
um, and I went through a lot of trauma to get there too.
Right.
And resolving of the trauma, as you talked about, it's resolving of the trauma that's important. um, but it was more the reaction, being able to take that step back,
Yeah.
and go, okay, if I do it this way, it's probably not going to get a great result, but if I do it another way, which is the way I chose to do it, that it resulted in a better relationship with my son, referring to those women in Afghanistan again,
Hmm.
that having that more communicative relationship, is better off. But how because you talk about that through your book, about these principles to go through and steps to go through. Do you want to talk us through some of that, how someone can go on that journey? Well, firstly, how to recognize it, and then steps to go through that journey.
Yeah, the journey towards having less reactivity and
Correct.
more choice.
Yeah.
Well, I would say the healing process that I've talked about, becoming aware of violence, sharing our stories, somatic practices. Again, this is what creates the foundation in us to be able to have the space to make choice and to see other possibilities,
Mm.
r- rather than having a reaction that is not even, that is in a sense automatic, that just
Mm.
happens to us in a sense when we're in a reactive state.
Yeah.
In experiencing our own healing, doing this healing work, we get more resilience, we see more choices.
Mm.
In a sense, I would see it as things slowing down.
Ah, yeah.
And I will add in the one part of my book, and kind of another approach towards healing is with contemplative practices. And this is, I would say, a fairly uh, for lack of a better word, advanced type of healing practice. It's not really where most people are starting from with the healing work. It wouldn't make sense for most people to be starting from here, but working with contemplative practices.
Mm,
And this is finding forgiveness for
yeah,
ourselves for
yeah.
violence we have committed, forgiveness of others who have committed violence against us, finding compassion for ourselves for violence we've experienced,
Mm,
compassion for others for violence they've experienced. And then this can be challenging, but
mm,
compassion for others who've committed violence, compassion for ourselves for violence that we have committed.
mm,
And this is a tricky thing, because in having compassion for ourselves for violence that we have committed, we don't want to be dismissing or saying, oh, it doesn't mean it was okay. We actually want to both be holding, I did things that were contrary to my principles,
yeah,
that the principles that I hold today, I would not want to do those things again. I don't feel good about those things I did. And I can have compassion for myself for the situation I was in, the reasons that I was the way that I was, the reasons why I was reactive. And in talking about this, creating, in a sense, slowing things down within ourselves and having more choice, I think these can be very valuable practices to even if it's just a little bit, if we've practiced compassion, to be able to find a sliver of that in a moment when we might be on the verge of becoming reactive, actually instead having compassion for what might, just even a sliver of compassion for this person who might be responding to us aggressively.
yeah. How does someone slow things down to, because that is such an important thing, because in, as you say, in that moment when I think you mentioned earlier, in the moment you're reacting from a certain part of your brain which is fight or flight, and
Yeah.
that's very, very limiting. It doesn't see bigger things, but as soon as you slow things down you can see other options. What can a person do in that moment to slow things down, to give themselves that opportunity to react differently?
Take a breath.
It's so much. Isn't it funny how the solutions can be really simple, though?
It is. And and I think it almost needs to be that simple, because if you're on the verge of losing
Mm,
that that moment of choice, you don't have time to be going into any sophisticated kind of practice in that moment. But
yeah,
just something as simple as taking a breath can just create that little bit of space.
yeah. Because that's interesting. You talk about that, and my friend and my son's karate sensei, he has five. He calls them the 5 Ds for de-escalating conflict, and the first one is
Mm,
distance. Put some distance between yourself and whatever the conflict situation is. So
right.
taking a breath is an important thing. But in that moment, is it, as you mentioned before, we form patterns of behavior. So is it a case of the person needs to be, and when we form patterns of behavior, they become habits, and it just becomes a cause and react. We're not actually even consciously thinking about it. So is it a case of a person needs to be consciously aware first? And you mentioned about discussion, which might bring that about.
Right.
And so what can someone do to say, well, firstly, is it where if someone's reacting that way, can another person bring that to their attention to help bring it to conscious awareness, or just have part of a discussion? How would you do that?
Well, it's tricky. So certainly I would say, a skilled conversation can be very helpful, but when someone is, if they're already in a triggered state or on the verge of that, what is said there can easily push them into even more trigger, and into the
Yeah.
reactivity as well. So certainly skillful conversation, and I would say, in a sense, the foundation of skillful conversation, and I'm almost going in a circle here, is to be able to have a conversation skillfully. We need to have this foundation of healing and peacefulness within ourselves.
Yeah. So could someone bring it up from the perspective of, because if you're attacking someone, so saying you're doing this, that's an attack as well. But if you say, I feel this when this happens, is that a way of de-escalating it? Is there skills like that that we can use to bring that up?
It can be. I certainly wouldn't say that's going to work every time,
Yeah.
but it certainly is it's a great tool that can work sometimes, for sure.
Yeah. And on the healing process, you mentioned there about forgiveness of yourself.
Yeah.
How much of that is recognizing the difference between the person and the behavior? Because we've all, as you say, we all have the tendency to do that. And I'm sure I'd be, as much as I haven't yelled at my son, I've certainly had my share of yelling when I was younger.
Mm.
And letting go of that and recognizing that that's a behavior, not who you are. Is that, how does someone do that through that healing process?
I think that is a really beautiful perspective on forgiveness, that when we're working on forgiving someone, we're working on forgiving the behavior. Sorry, we're working on forgiving the person,
Yeah.
not on forgiving their behavior. Because in
Mm,
some sense, we could say the behavior was counter to our principles. It was
yeah.
unacceptable. We could say, in a sense, unforgivable.
Mm,
But it was a person who behaved in this way,
yeah.
who, in some sense, must have had their own reasons.
Mm,
If they weren't, in a sense, good reasons, they had reasons that led them to behave the way that they did.
yeah.
And I think that can be powerful for finding forgiveness of the person. In talking about forgiveness, I do want to emphasize too that that practicing forgiveness is very much a practice. It's, I would say,
Mm,
counterproductive to be focused on forgiveness as a goal. Like, oh, I can't forgive this person. I haven't forgiven this person, so I don't feel good about myself, and because I haven't forgiven them, and I should forgive them. But then you sit with it and say, I can't forgive them. Well, you know what? That's actually part of the practice. Finding that in this moment, I actually don't forgive this person. That's really valuable information. That's like,
mm,
oh, I'm still holding emotions. There's actually, that's pointing to more work that I have to do in
yeah.
myself. Okay, I'm actually going to put aside this person right now. I have more work to do in myself, in regard to what happened, to what I experienced. So the practice of forgiveness is, in a sense, it's an exploration. It's not a, I think it's important to stay away from any idea of should or have to. You may never forgive a person. You maybe should never forgive a person on some level. And in a sense, that's okay. It's okay not to forgive. It'd probably be very liberating if you ever do reach that point, and it has to be reached organically, not that you need to or should right now.
And that's something I was wondering about from the perspective of separating the person from behavior. Because when we talk about holding on to not forgiving, I mean, I know from my own experience, when I've done that in the past, that creates a level of tension in that, well, it did create a level of tension in my body. And
Absolutely.
I'm liking that to, part of the reason for not forgiving, and it might be an extreme way of describing it, but it was almost like I was trying to get revenge,
Hmm.
because it was like, how dare, and this is where I was, from my perspective, and certainly my own journey was being able to separate. Okay, that behavior was inappropriate, completely inappropriate, and it shouldn't ever happen again. And I'll do things in my own power to make sure that it doesn't happen again. And
Right.
from the to the extent of not being around those people if need be. I'm using that as an example. I'm being very generalistic here without getting into specific examples.
Sure.
But from my perspective, I noticed, and I think about it from, whether it's getting revenge or feeling that your way of getting revenge, because that's kind of how I internalized it. And as we've heard before, seeking revenge is kind of like taking poison and hoping the other person dies. It does you more damage. And as you say, you mentioned before, it's an indicator of there's still some more healing to go, and being able to forgive. And part of that, I wonder how much of that, when I look at my own experience, was me beating myself up for being in that situation, as
Mm.
opposed to, maybe beating myself up isn't the right terminology, but being hard on myself for being in that situation and not forgiving myself for going, hey,
Mm.
that's just a circumstance. I need to let that go. I mean, how
Right.
much of that is important to that healing process to actually let go of those things and to because being in tension is not peaceful. If you're aiming to be in a peaceful with yourself, how do we do that? How do we let go of that?
Well, how do we do it? I mean, it's a practice. We work with it, keep coming back to it. And I do think, you mentioned that tension, and
Mm,
especially in regard to things that happened a long time ago with people who we may not even be in contact with, or at least not in regular contact with anymore.
mm,
If we haven't forgiven those people, in some sense, it's not even the person anymore that we are not forgiving. We're just, all as we have of that person is a memory of them. In a
yes.
sense, we are, that person as we perceive them has become a part of ourself that
Mm,
we are not forgiving.
yes.
So that right there is actually, it doesn't even have anything to do with the person anymore, as unacceptable as their behaviors may have been at that time in the past.
Mm.
We're in a sense holding a tension in ourselves in relation to that person.
Yeah, that's really important to know that it is, yeah, especially, I mean, if the person's no longer in your life, and that is quite common where people will hang on to something from their childhood and they haven't seen the person could have even died and they're
Right.
still holding on to it. And I,
Right.
I want to, I'm not up to date with the latest news, but I was looking at the there was a NFL, I think it was NFL in America, football player Ray Rice, and he very violently attacked his wife or girlfriend at the time in an elevator, and and then they went through this process, and they stayed together, and their relationship changed dramatically. She obviously forgive him, and there was an interview that I watched where both of them were there, and they talked about that experience, and went, okay, this was, it was a one-off, isolated incident. There was a whole bunch of factors that contributed to that, and
Mm.
they talked through that. It was an interesting. I think it was one of the news channels in America, and you can find it on YouTube. That's where I found
Mm.
it. But it was an interesting process where they talked through all these factors that resulted in that circumstance happening at that point in time, and then they resolved that. They moved forward from that. And in when you look at the actual tape, because there was video of
Mm.
it, it is like, well, how could she forgive him for that? And she talks through that. She explains that process, which is really interesting, and it created that dynamic. But
Mm.
again, I'm coming back to that point of the difference between the person and the behavior, and obviously if a behavior
Right.
is repeating itself, then that's a different circumstance, and we're not talking
Absolutely.
about, but we're talking about your own healing here, because obviously from her perspective, had she held on to that, I mean, it would have affected her as well, continuing going forward with her life. But you could see in the way they were talking, there was that difference. But is it
Mm.
really, do you really need to come to terms with that as a person to go, well, okay, on your journey, recognizing that I do need to forgive, that I need to let that go. It's going to be in my interest to do that.
Well, again, first of all, I wouldn't ever put you need to do so, just because
Okay.
I think that can put the kind of a shaming. Oh, well, you should, you have to, you haven't gone far enough or something if you haven't forgiven.
Yeah.
It really is fine wherever you are, and the
Yeah.
forgiveness is a practice. And actually, along those lines, I'll say too that I do see forgiveness as being a spiral, just like I talked about
Yeah.
for healing. There's levels of forgiveness. There's,
Mm.
you know, I certainly have the experience, like, okay, you know, I've totally forgiven the someone who bullied me, let's say.
Yes.
But then actually feeling that forgiveness actually opens up the possibility for more subtle things to come up in relation to that person that I haven't forgiven.
Mm.
So I see it as being cycles. So I would never say, okay, I've completely forgiven this person. It's done. I'm done with the practice. I've forgiven everybody. I've completely, there's no further forgiveness to be done. I'm like, well, I mean, if that's true for someone, wonderful. They're far more evolved than I am. But for most people, what I would say is, when you do find forgiveness,
Mm.
great, beautiful, savor that moment, enjoy that. It's probably going to bring you a lot of freedom. And you might also expect that it's actually going to open up space for more subtle things that you haven't forgiven to arise. So that's the first. So that's the first thing. Do you need to forgive? Um, it's all a process. It's a spiral, and wherever you are right now is also totally okay. I wouldn't say you need to forgive. It is, and it's certainly deeply healing to do so. So is it
Yeah.
valuable to do so? Yes. Does it create freedom for you? Yes. Is it going
Yeah.
to improve your is it likely to improve your life and your relationships? Yes. And just be wherever you are with it right now. And this is, in a sense, is why I would talk about um, forgiveness and compassion as being quite advanced healing practices.
Mm.
That if
Yeah.
you go in them expecting, in a sense, when you're working somatically, it's easier to hold an expectation that you're going to release patterns and, in a sense, feel better in your body, to find more freedom there, etc. To release emotions that might be kind of, stuck in the patterns of tension in our body. But when we get into forgiveness, it really requires to do it well, to be healthy in relation to it, to
Mm.
really be able to be process oriented and not outcome oriented with it.
Yeah, that's a very important point, and I'm glad you raised the need component, because it is a process. It doesn't mean you have to do it, but it's certainly, there's a lot of benefit to doing that.
Right.
Um, with that process of sorry, I was so engrossed in what you're doing there. I've lost my train of thought, which was my New Year's resolution was to listen more. So that's where it's been really wonderful. With the that process of forgiveness, is that, as you say, it's a journey to go through, and I mean, with the benefits for that, is it a case of, okay, we need to, or not, I shouldn't use the word need, that we recognize it's in our interest to forgive. What are steps someone can take to go along that journey to go, oh, all right, it's going to be beneficial for me to forgive. I'm feeling all this tension. This tension is obviously creating stress in my body, which is reducing my lifespan, affecting other ways that I'm relating to people. What are some of those steps that they can take to go through that forgiveness process?
So there's some different processes that we could use. One that, I think, the one I want to talk about in a little more detail. You could do this with forgiveness, but I actually think finding compassion is a little more direct to the point
Mm.
with this way. And the way I like to work with this is to bring attention to the heart space,
Yeah.
and just as a meditation, and we're using imagination, and just it's a contemplative practice. And so bring awareness to that space in the heart, and to invite just forgiveness, let's go with compassion, a feeling of compassion in the
Mm.
heart, and to just stay focused on that until there's really kind of some kind of palpable feeling
Yes.
of love and compassion in the heart.
Mm.
And once there's kind of a clear feeling of that, visit a memory. And to
Mhm.
start with, I wouldn't recommend going to, the most intense memory, the most memory of the most severe violence. Pick
Yeah.
something relatively mild the first time
Mm.
you do this, and just become clear about that memory. You might consider what you experienced at the time, what you felt in your body at the time, what emotions came up for you at the time. And when you think about it, what emotions come up for you now, what you feel in your body now.
Mm.
And then once you have those clearly, invite those into your heart,
Yeah.
into that felt sense of compassion in your heart,
Yes.
and let them unfold there. Uh,
Mm.
Sometimes there's a a feeling of them being consumed, almost like like they're being consumed in flames,
Yeah.
not in a destructive kind of way, but just they're being consumed by compassion.
Yeah. I love that. I'm gonna come back because I found my note that I got lost on before, and
Sure.
with that, because that links to what you're talking about, finding this compassion. Because what I was the point that I was going to raise was if, I was talking with someone and they talked about how they were bullied when they were younger in school, similar as you talked about, and then they said, you know, later on in life, this is 20 odd years, 25 years later, they found out because that bully actually contacted them because this person, the person that was bullied, had gone on and developed a successful business and was quite prominent on social media, uh, and and that bully had actually come up to him at a speaking event that he was at and said, I've been following you for such a long time. I'm a big admirer of what you do, and you just inspire me." Um, uh, and it was interesting, and I'm wondering about that process of, even if we know the person, if we're still around the person, that we might still be holding on to a circumstance that was a long time ago, and the situation might be different now. How important is it to recognize that might be the case as well?
I think that can help us find some freedom and notice the difference of who we are now, and who, you can almost think of it as parts of ourself. And sometimes, where younger versions of ourselves are still parts of ourselves, and sometimes, these younger parts of ourselves, in a sense, kind of take over.
Yes.
And I think this experience of separation, of the way things were then, and who we were then, and who we are now, can just create a little more, space with these parts, and can
Mm.
invite compassion for those younger parts of ourselves.
Yeah, great point. Separating what happened then to who you are now, which again comes back to that, separating the person from the behavior, because behaviors you had when you were a child, well, certainly from my perspective, I'm glad they're different from when I was younger.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah.
um,
I'm on board with that.
With one of the things I want to touch on too, or before we do that, because I think what you mentioned, well, not, I think you did mention several times that one of the things is having this discussion. This is where my other Crocodile Dundee quote's going to come in, and it's talking about when they're they're in a high rise having at a fancy party, and they're talking about psychologists, and she says to him, you probably don't have a psychologist at Walkabout Creek. And he goes, no, we just have Wally. If we have a problem, we tell Wally. Wally tells everybody else, no more problem. And is it as simple as that, where we're just having those conversations can allow us to have that freedom to know that we're not alone, that we're not, that other people are going through something similar, and that reduces some of that of what we're feeling, including shame and guilt. And how do we start those conversations?
So I'm going to say yes and no to that. In some sense, yes, as simple as telling our stories, I think has healing value to it.
Mm.
And especially for stories that have intensity for us, I
Yeah.
think it's critical to be sharing, at least at the very least for the first time we share them, with someone who is very skilled as
Yeah.
a listener.
Mm-hmm.
Meaning that the response of so many people when they hear something difficult or
Mm.
intense, often they're in their own discomfort and they
Yeah.
respond from that,
Yeah.
and generally in ways that are can be, well, I'll just, one common way is to give advice. Oh, well, you need to do this now.
Yeah.
Or making generalizations. Oh, well, yeah, that happened to you, but really the world is
Yeah.
it's a safe place or something like that.
Yeah.
And telling stories that have intensity to them and
Mm.
having them received in a way that is not the most skillful,
Yeah.
I don't think is of a great deal of service. Maybe, it got off your chest just a little bit, but I don't see as really having the deep healing potential that compared to sharing with someone who is, skilled, generally trained to, hear such stories and to respond to them skillfully, to really hold the space for you to fully share and explore, to actually invite you into deeper exploration and to accept you non-judgmentally, even with this story. I think that is, and in general, I'm going to say, this would mean a listening professional of some type, a
Mm.
psychotherapist, social worker, psychologist, certain types of coaches, etc. These are the people who are generally going um, to really be able to hear these stories skillfully. And some people sometimes, if you have a loved one who you see as being a skilled listener, and especially if you could set up the context for them to really hear something intense and be able to receive you, then that certainly can be very healing as well. And in some sense, being often after you've shared stories with a professional, being able to share them with a loved one as well can be even more deeply healing. But would generally encourage people to start with sharing with a professional
Yeah.
who really is going to be able to receive them well, to listen skillfully. And so my top recommendation would not be to just go share them with any old Wally who's going to share them with
Yeah.
anyone else.
Yeah.
And that said, there is also, I think that that scene from Crocodile Dundee is in a sense pointing to something that is true. In a sense, they're skillful listening in many ways isn't anything other than putting our own reactivity and trauma aside to be fully with the other person and receive them. And and I think we need to work on our own trauma a lot before we can really learn to become skillful listeners for others. But really, truthfully, most people I don't see as having an abundance of that skill.
Yeah. Skillful listening is really being able to listen without thinking of a response. And that's, I know from my own journey,
Yeah.
it's many years ago, or even not too long ago, I was always thinking about what to say next. And that's where, even as an interviewer, I got caught out before because I'm so busy listening to you that I forgot my notes and that kind of thing, which is, well, that was my only New Year's resolution, was to be more active in listening. Coming back to moving towards a more peaceful society, and this might spark a bit of controversy, but I'm going to go there anyway.
Okay.
Is it a case of we need to have a really traumatic experience for us to be able to do that? And I'm going to reference, because in Australia, we have very different laws in certain aspects to America, and part of that comes about. Many years ago, we had a gun massacre in Port Arthur. Now, and what's interesting about that, because I've done a bit of research in that, was at that point in time, because America is generally known as, where gun massacres happen, which is interesting given, all the other violence that happens in the world. America is where gun massacres occur, or is known for that.
Yeah.
But the thing was, at that time when Port Arthur occurred, it was off the charts compared to anything that had happened in America, anything that happened anywhere else in the world. And for Australia at that time, because it was so, for us, not only for the world it was off the charts, but for us it was so far off the charts. It was so traumatic. Now, and that's not to say that everyone was on board with that. It was actually really, really difficult to change the gun laws here. But is it a case, and I'm not getting into the gun debate, that's where I said this might be stepping into an area which could be controversial, and I know it is in America. But what I'm getting at from that point of view is does it take that kind of really, really traumatic experience to make a change towards a more peaceful society, or can we do that without having those traumatic experiences?
So I don't think violence ever leads to greater peace directly. What I think it can lead to illusions of greater peace. So I don't know the details of what unfolded from this massacre that you are referring to, but I believe it led to more gun control and things like that.
Yeah,
Which
so
I'm going to say,
there's a significant change in gun laws in Australia, where basically there's very little that the average person in the society can have. So
right.
Yeah.
So
But it's more about, not about whether gun control, because I know that's a controversial part of this, but it's more about, do we need to have that experience, that really traumatic experience, before we go, oh, we need to make a change? Or can we do that without having that traumatic experience?
I think it needs to happen without the traumatic experience, in a sense,
Yeah.
because even creating more laws, creating more constraints, in my mind, that's not really creating a more peaceful society. That's creating a more constrained society that looks more peaceful, that yes,
Okay.
may prevent that extreme violence, but in a sense, what came out of that was more trauma. And I see this as all being cycles of trauma, and I don't think there's anything to come out of trauma except, in a sense, for the potential for more trauma, unless people do the healing work on themselves and together. So I suppose that this explosive violence can brings more awareness, which could lead more people to do healing work. But that's not actually what I hear very much, in terms of like, oh, there was a gun massacre, we all need to do more healing work. It's like, no, we need more gun control. And putting that aside, that controversial issue, that to me is completely aside, for or against gun control. It's completely aside from the
Mm,
importance of actually doing healing work to so that we don't have those explosive reactions
yeah.
ourselves in relation to other people. And certainly those explosive reactions that someone is having where they kill other people, where they kill large numbers of other people, that's about the most extreme case
Mm,
of this reactivity. But on the other hand, it's still that same reactivity into violence,
mm,
which I think it takes internal healing work in order to really heal those and prevent violence on all scales.
yeah.
Even taking, going to even what I would say a more extreme violence than a gun massacre, Russia invading Ukraine.
Mm,
And certainly the scale of violence and the severity of violence there is a different world from a
yes.
bully on the playground.
Mm,
But there's something in that process that I actually see as having a lot in common.
yes.
I've looked for evidence of this and haven't found any, but I strongly suspect that Putin has been a victim of violence, and
Mm,
that in some sense his decision to invade Ukraine was in a sense, we could say, blowing out his own trauma that he
yes.
doesn't know how to deal with onto an entire country.
Mm,
And he has so much power that when he reacts violently, when he can't deal somatically, contemplatively with his own trauma, the number of people who get hurt and killed, etc., is astronomical.
mm,
And in some way, I see his process of doing so, of deciding to do so, of reactively doing so, of his lack of care for or concern for his impact on the lives of people, the bodies of people, as having a lot in common with a bully on the playground.
yeah, good point. So what you're saying is really we don't have to go through this traumatic experience. Actually, if we deal with our own experiences and our own trauma, that's just going to naturally lead to being okay. Well,
Yeah.
very simply putting that very simplistically, but if we don't have that
Yeah.
trauma, we're not going to react that way. If everyone doesn't have that trauma, no one's going to react that way. I
Exactly.
understand. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Want to turn to now as well the excitement that comes with violence. There's an
Mm.
inherent, for example, and there's places where, for example, yeah, if you were to take the NFL, if someone's on the street outside of the NFL, an NFL game, someone's on a street standing at a traffic light waiting, and a person comes and tackles them just out of the blue. Now that's an inappropriate behavior, and it's a violent behavior, and certainly you'll
Mhm.
get in trouble for that. But in a football game, if the tackle it's a different scenario there. It's okay there. How do we address that? Because I mean, if we were to take all violence out, for example, take everything that would be constituted violence outside of a football game out of the football game, it'd be
Right.
pretty boring. How do we address that? What's acceptable, and where do we draw the lines?
Well, first of all, I may become unpopular with a few people for saying this, but I actually do have quite serious concerns
Mm,
about the amount of violence in American football. I
yeah.
actually would see that as an instance of capacity for violence being glorified, and
Mm,
so many of these linemen that have with their full strength and they have a lot of strength, two of them coming together and, striking helmets. There's so much issues with brain damage leading to depression in the years after they've played professional football. So to me, American football actually has a level of violence that I don't find acceptable, let's say.
Yeah.
So, but going a step beyond that, I think one of the things you're pointing to is that, to an extent, as humans, and probably even more so as men with higher levels of testosterone, there is a natural aggression in us, a competitiveness, an excitement towards those possibilities. Putting aside American football, I think there are many other, like most other sports, are actually great examples of healthy ways of channeling and exploring and even enjoying, of savoring those aspects, being able to be competitive with other people without intending to hurt anyone, without directly creating the potential of striking other people and hurting them. And there's always risk of injury in most sports, and those are contained. That's part of the excitement, and it's not that the risk of injury is the direct result of being struck and being hit or tackled with aggression.
Yeah. Because is it something that can be, from that perspective, as you say, I mean, there's an inherent release from that. Playing golf, there's a lot of talk in therapy where any striking sports are good if you're feeling that inside you, to go and whack something, like a golf ball or tennis ball or cricket. Well, you guys don't have cricket, but it's another game that exists in the world. I'm being honest. But having that striking mentality, and as a release, that there's research that says that's good and we should be able to do that. Is it a case of setting the boundaries for, okay, this is what's acceptable in the game, but not in society? And I'm going to draw another experience because I'm actually a big NASCAR fan. And there was an experience on the racetrack this year, or last year, 2022, between Bubba Wallace and Kyle Larson, where they had an incident. Bubba Wallace has got out of the car, and Kyle Larson has been through some training because he had some issues beforehand, and they have some training to how to deal with situations now. And Bubba Wallace has come across and been very upfront and started pushing him, and Kyle, through the training that he had, reacted very differently. And what I also noticed was the commentators highlighted that how inappropriate Bubba's behavior was, and how well and professionally Kyle Larson had handled that. So, and that seemed to reinforce, okay, there's a certain way of behaving. Yes, in NASCAR, obviously, or for those who don't know, rubbing is racing. You're allowed to punt each other on the track and that kind of thing. So there's a level of aggression there with that. But to take it that step further with starting a fight after and one-on-one was shown as not being appropriate. Do you think it's a case of setting, these are the rules? We do have a natural tendency. We have the testosterone that leads to more or can lead to more aggression if not in control. Do you think it's a case of having that education and going, well, this is okay in the game. It's not okay to as was mentioned before, it's not okay to tackle someone on the street, whether and I hear what you're saying about brain injury, that kind of thing. But if the rules say it's okay in the game, we're really taught about it shouldn't, it's in the game, not outside of the game.
Right. I think that is important. And I do think that there are certain sports where, from my perspective, it is, even if we say, well, this is the rules of the game, it's okay only here. it really still is encouraging too much violence. For example, in American football, I would say the same thing about boxing. It's like, okay, well, it's okay if you fight when you're in the ring.
Mm.
There's just too much risk of that kind of that behavior spilling over
Yeah.
to, to for that to, in my mind, to really be acceptable as a sport. But for most other sports, I would say yes, that's exactly what it is. It's saying, okay, this is a container where we're all agreeing to interact in this way, and
Yeah.
we only interact in that way inside of this container.
Yeah. So I want to draw as well because I'm. You mentioned, Russia and Ukraine. I'm actually, my background's Polish, Russian, and Ukraine. I'm a mix of all three. So I reconciled. So I'm sure they can. And it's the way I joke about it. But from that perspective, and I'm not, advocating, but I grew up with a strong Catholic upbringing. So I'm going to reference a Bible quote here because I did that. But they talk about the meek shall inherit the earth in the Bible. And and I have a few friends that are my neighbor across the road is a former pastor, and we were talking about this. And as he highlighted, and because we're having the discussion for that reason, was he said meek actually comes from the Greek, which means great power under control,
Mm,
and from what the original interpretation of that is what I understand. And certainly, if you read the Bible, it's not about just being peaceful. There's quite a lot of fight when you need to fight. And from what I
right.
understand, the original meaning of the meek shall inherit the earth wasn't the weak shall inherit the earth. It was a person that he's a warrior that doesn't draw their
Mm,
sword, someone that has, is strong within themselves,
mm,
um, but they have that well under control. And that's what I'm wondering, is that something in education that we need to have as part of that
mm.
journey, being able to say, hey, yeah, I've got this capacity to do that, but I've got, because you mentioned before in that circumstance where you have that, that tension coming up, take a breath, step back. Is that where we need part of that education that we need to have?
I think that would be valuable education, and I actually I really like that. I hadn't heard anything like that before about that quote, uh, but I really like that perspective on it. I like that a lot, and yeah, I think that definitely education along those lines would be valuable. I don't think that replaces kind of the deep healing work,
Yes.
and certainly such education sounds valuable to me.
Well, yeah, because that's what I'm looking as part of that deep healing work is having that recognition that unless we drain the testosterone, I'm talking about guys here, but for that same women have the capacity for violence as well,
Sure,
but unless we drain testosterone, right, which is I mean it's there for a reason. I don't know what
absolutely.
that reason is, but as you say, it's going through that healing work, and then from the other side of that, because I look at that from my perspective with my son, we spent a lot of time, talking about this kind of thing, and said he did karate for the stillness, the control, that kind of thing, and
Mm,
that's projected in his life now. It's just he's
yeah,
just a very calm, still person. Sure, I mean, he's over 6 foot. He's almost got his black belt in karate. He can do 100 push-ups. He's not a small guy, so he has great capacity if he wanted to, but you wouldn't get that, and he has that great power under control. He obviously has, well, I think he has the healing side of things because he hasn't had
yeah.
that violence at all. So I'm
Mm,
just wondering, is
beautiful.
it a combination we have to go through this healing, we have to deal with the trauma, and we have to understand those higher principles that we live by? Is that something that we're working towards? And
I certainly hope so. I wanted to see it become a lot more widespread than I think it is right now. But that's certainly, let's say, my aspiration
mm,
for for humanity, for our culture, and yeah,
fantastic. And I know you've got we've gone longer than we expected, and you've got a meeting coming up, so we need to wind this up. In doing that, moving towards what you're aiming to achieve, what are some of the key wisdoms, or even just one key wisdom, yeah, your choice, that you would impart as the final knowledge that you'd like to share with the audience?
So men engaging with healing work, I think, is far too much of a rarity in the world today. I think
Mm,
in order for, I see male on male violence as being, in a sense, a key issue that underlies so many other issues. So many issues that are actually, I think, getting far more attention and work on them.
mm,
I see working on them as being superficial at best if we don't also address male on male violence.
yeah.
So this being such an important issue, and I think an issue that doesn't get talked about nearly enough,
Mm,
and and men doing their healing work is almost being a bit of an anomaly in our society more than the norm.
yeah.
I see this as really needing to change to make this a better world for everybody: men, women, children, animals, the entire ecosystem, the entire planet. So my one kind of piece of wisdom and is for men: please do your healing work, whatever that means to you, whatever you feel drawn to, whatever seems to work for you right now. Just do it, engage with it, and yeah, whatever it is. And I was talking earlier about, through a little bit of a compassion practice, and just want to mention, I on my website there are audio recordings of the meditations that are in my book around for these contemplative practices. Those are available there in more detail. And there's lots of different ways to do healing work, so find what works for you, and please do it for yourself, do it for your family, do it for everyone.
It's fantastic. For people to reach out to you and find your book and other resources, what are the we'll put them in the show notes, but what are the best ways to reach out to you and to where to find your book?
Simplest way to find it is to go to my website, peacefulmanbook.com, all one word, peacefulmanbook.com. And there's a link to my book on Amazon there. You can join, I run men's groups, so you can sign up to receive notifications about those. My email address is there, so feel free to reach out with me. I do individual work as well, and I'm happy to engage, answer any questions that anyone might have.
That's fantastic, Brad. Certainly, we'll be sharing those in the show notes and sharing those workshops and that you run as well, because I think it's a very valuable cause to help a lot of people. Brad, it's been so wonderful having you on the show. So much amazing knowledge. Thank you for being part of this.
Thank you for having me here, Damien. Enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you for being part of the Share.care community and helping people around the world prosper. You're creating a bigger pie for everyone to share. The more people contributing to the world being a better place, the better the world becomes for others and for you.